On that note, this would be a good time to invite our other speakers up. So it reflects what I was thinking here. So what we've learned this morning is that we shouldn't use cells, we shouldn't use mice, we shouldn't extrapolate. And it reminds me of what Lisa said is that even Newton got away from using the terms cause and effect, and Mach had even said in nature there is no cause and there is no effect. So it makes me wonder, should we even held this meeting? But in reality, as the name of the committee is that we do have to make decisions. We do have to decide on these things. And so even though philosophically there's challenges, we have reality we have to deal with. And I think that this would be a good time for the panel they can take off their hats now and think about how do we go beyond these clear limitations that we have with these systems to actually make positive moves forward in protecting human health. So I'm going to leave it quite broad for people to kind of address some of these thoughts and where we could come to some common ground to actually make sounder decisions on human health.
I'd love to start. It was a very difficult side to be on the con side, on the one hand, because if there is concern about a health hazard, I really would tend toward wanting to move toward action, understanding how critical it is to be health protective. And Vince Cogliano said yesterday, it's one thing to be predictive and probabilistic, it's another to be health protective. So I found it very difficult to have to push yet again a message of inaction. At the same time, it wasn't that hard. And so when Gary asked me, would you be willing to take this on, and mercury and cardiovascular are not my areas at all. Once I understood that I was on the con side, I realized, okay, this isn't difficult because I can easily poke holes in the epidemiologic literature, and that's what my job was to do. But what I mentioned previously was the gold standard of these prospective studies in order to establish temporality takes a tremendous amount of time and energy and investment, and a long time before we could actually make decisions. So to hold us to that in order to fully establish ironclad causality is highly unrealistic. We have to be far more nimble and able to make decisions in the context of the best available evidence, even if it's not perfect. We have to do that. So I use the models of causality and approaches to theoretical ways of understanding the world simply to say that that's all well and good from a scientific exercise, but in reality decisions do have to be made. So I was hopeful I was able to not stymie the ability to move forward on this issue.
And you did a great job. You had me convinced. But no, I want to refer to something that Lisa said that was very appropriate, and that is that in our case example that we were arguing, if one says we don't have the evidence to put that endpoint into play for whatever the context is, then we're assuming there is no cardiovascular risk from being exposed to methylmercury. I think that's basically what you're putting it in, not putting it into the risk-benefit equation. You're saying that there is no risk there. So if that's your choice, and you've got the kinds of evidence that I tried to line up today, then you're going from, it's really an all or nothing kind of, which was, again, your point, all or nothing kind of question. And so that makes the stakes even bigger, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. I think somebody brought this up yesterday at the end of the day, but the context for each of these debates is really quite important. And if the decision that you're making is relatively inconsequential, it's easy to proceed either with very little data or with no data and make a decision, and it doesn't have a big consequence, of course, by definition. If the decision you're making is highly consequential, then I think that you have a responsibility to make that decision either by doing something or not doing something, and then understanding what the consequences of being wrong are, and taking that into account in that decision-making process. And that's the part I think that we don't, as scientists, I don't think we really structure that thinking into our work. But as regulators, as policymakers, as decision makers, that's always present in the work. And I think that's a bridge that, you know, scientists in the regulatory environment deal with all the time. Scientists in maybe in an academic environment deal with less consistently and maybe less effectively in some cases. So.
I wouldn't mind just very quickly referring to something Keith said before, which is that if your level of causal evidence could be rated, then perhaps we could put a weighting factor in a risk-benefit debate like this or in a regulatory decision-making context and say that instead of 80% of the risk versus 20 for neurodevelopment, maybe it would be less than that if you're not as confident, but it would still be in the mix.
Building off of what Lisa was saying, you know, I think what it speaks to is, and you saw these examples all across the board, the context matters, and the question that you're trying to ask matters with regards to what are the tools, what are the approaches that are the right approaches and tools to take. So if you think about the regulatory environment, it strikes me that we don't have an agile enough regulatory environment, we don't have a transparent enough one, and a quantitative enough one that has a systematic framework that can be adjusted appropriately for those big decisions versus smaller impact decisions, for the situations wherein you want to have a more focused approach versus a broader approach. And that, in essence, is the complexity of this science, and finding a way to standardize that, quantify that, do that perhaps in a computational way to take out as much bias as possible and conflict of interest as possible would be really helpful. Because if you're dealing in a pharma situation, if you're dealing in an industrial chemical situation, if you're dealing in a remediation situation or epidemiology situation, you have completely different tools and context for which to make those decisions.
I would like to follow up with what Dr. Rosselpour just said and build on that. So first of all, I don't work in the regulatory space, so I guess I'm lucky I don't have to deal with a lot of these issues. But I think from all three of the debates, what we see is that a one-size-fits-all is not going to work. And in fact, as you point out, we need to have certain criteria as to what approaches and tools we use ultimately to make some of these very difficult decisions. And so, again, just to emphasize that one size is never going to fit all for this purpose. We have a large toolbox, and we should be using those. And it's not just context, but also in terms of what information do we have already in terms of toxicity that we can make those decisions.
If I could just add to that just a bit further, something else that struck me from themes that I heard yesterday, and then again trying to trace the long-term thread of grappling with causation, since philosophers wrote about this, is the place of the theory and the hypothesis. And with computationally intensive machine-driven approaches, and I'd love to hear from our colleague from Carnegie Mellon, to what extent do we abandon this notion of having to be deductive or inductive in our approaches? That if our computers can now extract actual associations, to what extent do we need qualitative assessments? Do we need expert judgment assessments? Or are we moving into a new place of it's not even a priori, it's entirely agnostic? And can we fully rely on the complexities of machine learning to get us to a better place that's not as fraught with the uncertainties of human judgment?
I'm not quite sure exactly which aspect of the sort of search and fishing expeditions that were referred to yesterday. We heard a lot yesterday, but it strikes me that you can develop associations in epidemiology, you could develop associations in metabolomics or transcriptomics and whatever kinds of GWAS, EWAS kinds of things you want to find associations in. And you still have to go back to the empirical experimental and figure out if there is plausibility and mechanism behind those associations, because so much of that could be spurious or just random. So, but I think you have to go fishing to see what the universe of possibilities are.
So one thing that makes you think about is our neighbors in Europe under the REACH legislation are really kind of changing the approach for this, and they're going to be generating a lot of data under this new paradigm. Is how can we learn from what they're doing in Europe, where they're going to depend much more on the in vitro things, and looking at their data, and can we use it to inform what we're doing on this side, where we're still, going to be, the animal models will still be very important. Like how might that inform what we're trying to do here?
Yeah, so I think I'm the only industry person in this room, right? But not on the webcast. Hello, people on the webcast. I would argue that I think that the REACH implementation has been similar to the bike lane analogy. Because in an ideal world, we would get a lot of this in vitro read-across data. And I think in reality, if you talk to people who are heavily into this, what has resulted is just a lot more animal testing. So we're learning perhaps more about molecules that we knew less about, but it is still based upon that animal-based system. I guess the opportunity here, I think, comes from the Lautenberg Act and TSCA reform. So our opportunity within the US is then to take, maybe those lessons from REACH and the fact that Europe, if we can put Europe as an entity, which is probably not fair, but speaking out of both sides of their mouth with regards to pushing, correctly so and beautifully so, in vitro alternatives, but at the same time demanding more studies and more in vivo studies without accepting those in vitro alternatives or read-across strategies. So there's a dichotomy going on there. For the Lautenberg Act and for TSCA reform, if we can actually reconcile these now and really use this as an opportunity to develop really nice read-across strategies, in vitro strategies, to pressure test the system that we have, I think that would be fantastic and can really accelerate us forward.
So how do we do that? Because what you're proposing is very much an experimental model to see if these things will work. And under our current framework, the academics aren't driven to do that, and the regulators don't have the freedom to really play in that space, it seems like.
So the way in which that could work is in the engagement between the regulator and industry. So, there's, for example, a need for different types of testing for PMNs or for existing molecules on the market. And there are a lot of in vitro approaches that could be utilized in order to address those endpoints. And there needs to be not only openness on both sides, because I know there is openness on both sides, but also the engagement of other stakeholders to see how those approaches would work. Perhaps for a short period of time, there needs to be some parallel work. Maybe you have a range of 10 analogs, and you do in vivo testing on the two extremes, and do the in vitro bridging across all of them. That's a model that has been used in some particular examples for where REACH read-across has worked out well. So we can take those case studies and utilize them within the US model.
Yeah, I do think that it's important for us to maintain a certain perspective about the fact that we when pushed, we tend to resort to defaulting to what we know, which is a long history of in vivo testing in animals. But I think Norb's presentation and other information, I think I've heard Kenny Crump say this a number of times, is why do we think it's so great that we can force gavage a chemical into an animal where it goes into the liver in huge amounts, and we do that for a lifetime, and that things happen in that animal, and that we think that that's so highly relevant to the human situation that we defer to that over all other types of information that we can develop. And I think that the push has been to really try to take a much more rational approach to molecular, in vitro, look adverse outcome pathway, try to really understand things from a very different point of view, and we have to sort of come back to how congruent does it need to be with the animal data, because how good is that animal data actually in predicting human experience? And I think that in not very many cases does the animal data really provide a very clear window on human experience. So I do think that it's important that we check our instinct to go back to what we're familiar with without really being critical about how predictive that familiar model really is.
Can I comment on that point, Lisa? Thank you. This is Merrilee Davenport from the National Academy. So this just reminds me to point out that this committee is going to be having a workshop in the next series of workshops for 2017 to 2018. One of the topics, I think, is related to what Lisa was saying. I'll read the long title, but it's basically, I think, about thinking of about our mindsets and what does it take from looking at social science to consider what it takes to change our mindsets and bringing people together to discuss that. And so I'll read the long title, which could use some wordsmithing, but cultivating confidence at the interface of changing environmental health data streams and decision making, and how do paradigms change. So that's on our docket for the next couple of meetings. And then I actually have a question. So my question is, as we start to tackle these issues with in vitro data and animal replacement and so on, I'm a splitter, so the lumpers and splitters, I'm a splitter, so my tendency is to try to think of how you split that out into something that you can focus on and work in different areas. And I was thinking of the work out of IARC with the hallmarks of cancer and carcinogenicity mechanisms. And so I guess my question is I would like the panel's thoughts on how to tackle these problems as far as ways to split them effectively. Is it by outcomes or pathology? Is it, best to try to tackle everything in cancer and then try to tackle immunology and then try to tackle liver and just kind of work through things? Or is that a naive kind of approach? So that's what I would like some reaction to or thoughts on.
So I think the field is already taking the approach of going down the path of where there are data-rich, low-hanging fruit, and I'm thinking specifically of endocrine disruption, and that's turning into kind of the proof of principle that we're going to use for mapping other in vitro test batteries into in vivo space.
Well, I would even go prior to that, back to the original mutagenicity and assays. And there, what we needed was a lot of empirical data to see how predictive they were of cancer and how many other kinds of mutagenicity in vitro screens do you need to improve your prediction. And so I think a lot of it is empirical driven, that if you've got data on an animal model that is able to predict out in vivo effects, you start developing more confidence. You may need to do different permutations and varieties of it, like we learned with the Ames test going out into, now we've got 3 different tiers of gene tox testing, at least, for being predictive. But we're really talking about how could we be maximally predictive of the in vivo animal/human experience. And to some degree, it's based upon empirical data, I think, to prove it.
And so, Merrilee, one thing that we also need to keep in mind with this is, despite what our friend down at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue would think, we live in a global world and a global economy, and therefore we have a global regulatory paradigm as well. And the big challenge is actually not going to be sorting it out in the more sophisticated regions and the sophisticated regulatory environments. It's going to be providing that confidence for the new approaches when there are geographies that are grabbing on to the approaches we've been using 50 years ago. So the approach we've been taking is do what you can, low-hanging fruit, acute, long-term studies, and try to find the appropriate dual path to gain confidence in those different types of approaches for the scientific community. But it is a long haul, and it's going to take industry, academia, and regulators to do this really all together in a global fashion.
Okay, let's go to Mike.
So a couple of comments and then a question. I thought great format. I just loved hearing the opposite sides of 3 different debates. And the comment about, the philosophical aspects of it. I think that the disagreements or the importance of the metaphysics of what causality is are absolutely minimal and don't really play. I think everybody's expressing incredibly complicated epistemological problems of trying to get evidence from the world that we're confident in that will bear upon, right, the causal questions at issue. And to comment on, you know, what I think we're getting from computational techniques, right, is just simply one piece, right, or one kind of evidence that will never supplant scientific judgment of all different types, experimental follow-ups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think there has been an amazing advance in trying to mathematically and rigorously model the difference between association and causation, and that has led to a bigger set of tools computationally that'll be a huge help, I think, as we go on. But that said, it's never going to replace, nor should it, the different kinds of considerations you all are doing. Okay, so the question I wanted to ask has to do with each of these debates, I think, presented, especially from a person like me who's sort of a layperson with the science here, a really nice portrayal of the difficulties that people face in bringing to bear this evidence. So you guys really had a great thing about, you know, when you have possible confounding, in this case negative confounding, which is fishy, how do you deal with that and what can you learn? And then the basic problem of extrapolating from chemical structure or something you know about the chemical to what it will do, right, which is incredibly, and then this in vitro versus in vivo was great. What I didn't hear, and what I guess my question will try to ask is, in each of these more near to debates, you pointed to situations in which, right, you don't get what you want from the in vivo or in vitro, but you didn't point to situations which we actually know from having previous experience when something in vivo really works, right, when the animal model works and when it doesn't, when the in vitro assays work and when they don't, and the same thing from the chemical thing. So I think that as time goes on, or as we know more and more, we're going to have situations where we say, okay, in this particular chemical or this particular kind of disease, the animal model is pretty good, even though maybe the transcriptomics are bad, right? And the same thing for the chemical structures. We're going to have, I think, better and better modeling techniques, but we're still going to face situations where, you know, we're going to be in a Utah landscape where there's complete cliffs of, you know, there's very, very unsmooth landscapes. So I guess the question is, what kind of progress do we think we're making on contextualizing when, like, these different sides of the debate actually help and when they don't? Long question.
So I think one of you pointed out a lot of key aspects of all this. One of the big challenges is the sharing of those data, right? And the sharing of those data broadly, particularly across a wide physical chemical space. I think that probably is going to be the biggest challenge to me in this extrapolation of in vivo, in vitro, understanding what models work, what models don't, is that depending on who's the most interested in that group, that entity, that industry, whatever it is, has pushed forth on that technology, and that may be very narrow with regards to their physical chemical space. And it's going to take that sharing of the data in broad ways and transparent ways so that others can model the data and compare it to what they're doing, that I think is going to help advance that forward, because we don't do those comparisons often enough.
But the other piece to that is, I mean, certainly we know when things work and don't when we compare from animal models to human, but we only know that after we do the assays in both, and that's too late. And so from a regulatory standpoint, yeah, I think it's very difficult to predict. I mean, certainly there's certain classes of drugs that we know, for example, need metabolism, which has to be taken into account in vitro systems and so forth. You know, the other area which I think is very exciting, but it's still not sufficiently developed, is this concept of organ on a chip, which is moving along. It's certainly not cheap to do, but you know, many of the points that that you raised in your debate, this idea of cell-cell interactions between not just cells of the same type, but across organ systems, the various types of regulatory factors they release and so forth. Those are very difficult to mimic with single cell or one type of cell type system. So you really need more complex models. You know, unfortunately, we're not quite there yet with you know, the organ on a chip But certainly that needs to move forward.
I think the other piece that we haven't really talked a lot about here, but that I think is part of certainly what's going on at EPA and some other places is better understanding exposure and metabolism. And because we look at a lot of these in vitro systems, and many of them incorporate either no or some very rudimentary metabolic activity, and of course the metabolism is incredibly complex. And my favorite example of this is that so there's a group, Michael McLaughlin group in Sweden, and they do a lot of work on persistent organic compounds. And they published a paper not too many years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where they had integrated a bioaccumulation model in the environment and a whole bunch of steps from release to, and they were able to predict very, very well using log KOW and a couple of other properties, bioaccumulation and exposure to humans and all of these steps, except for all the compounds where there was metabolism, which they couldn't predict, and which turned out to be a pretty big number. So they basically said we can do a lot with physical chemical properties except where we can't because there's all this metabolism which is not predictable. And so God love them. I mean, they really did a very complex sort of effort. But at the end, it was all tripped up by this issue of except when there's metabolism, which we didn't know that was going to happen. And so metabolism and then the issues associated with exposure. You can have the most potent compound in the world, but if the exposures are incredibly low, it's probably not that interesting. And you can have a relatively modestly toxic chemical, but if every infant in the country is getting a big dose of it, it's something you might want to worry about. And so understanding exposure and really keeping that at a forefront when we talk about these sorts of in vitro systems, both from the point of view of incorporating and understanding metabolism and from the point of view of how exposure occurs and where and why, I think is really pretty important for making intelligent decisions on these sorts of things.
And going in a totally different direction, but still trying to get at that question that was just asked. So rather than looking at metabolism, which of course is important distinction to make in terms of understanding what's happening, maybe from a genomic and from a high throughput and an in vitro perspective, if we were able to distinguish what makes the estrogen example such a good example of something that is predictive across phyla, and maybe thinking about, well, do we care so much about inducing stress response proteins, downstream events that are, these generic response events, inducing metallothionein genes. Is that what we should be focused on? Is that as predictive as something that's hitting something, the molecular initiating event? If we understand what's going on at that level, maybe a lot of the other biology will follow as we understand these AOPs more, and we'll be able to better predict to what's going to happen on a systems-wide in vivo if we understand what's happening up front. And maybe that's what the estrogen example is telling us, is that you understand what's happening up front for a key regulatory receptor, and you're going to know a lot about what to expect in vivo. I'm just speculating, but that may be a good way to try to break out where we're getting information.
So I want to address this sort of like prediction of the animal studies. In the field of psychology, there's been challenges about reproducibility, and so what the field's doing is proposing that they submit their hypothesis and study design up front, and then they publish the results, whatever they are. And there might be something like that where you can say, we're going to do this animal experiment, and based on the computational framework we have, we would predict this would happen. Then you do the experiment. We tend to publish the results and put it back into our narrative and change, reformulate the hypothesis. But if you add some sort of, field level effort of that, you actually might start seeing which things are predictive and which they aren't. We just don't design it that way. Kim.
Yeah, Kim Bukhari, Brown University. I'm wanting to cast back all the way to yesterday morning when we started the workshop. And the setup for the workshop was really around contributing causes to a multi-causal framework. And those contributing causes are very broad: socioeconomic, stress, racial discrimination, life stage experiences, very broad kinds of effects. So I'm wanting to hear, I guess, from the panel members for each of those kinds of technologies that you've used and talked about today, epi studies, tox studies, read across, in vitro, animal studies. How can we use those data streams to inform ourselves and then use that information to create a more coherent yet complicated and integrated assessment of effect?
Excellent question, Kim. I'm really glad that you came back to that schema, that framework that you provided us yesterday. And I did think about it in the context of that box with the question mark. And for epidemiology studies, we're better positioned to do that with respect to understanding community and societal factors. In environmental epidemiology, for the longest time, that has not been an acceptable approach. It's as though environmental epidemiologists and social epidemiologists or psychiatric epidemiologists would not necessarily converge or speak to each other. But that has changed dramatically in the last 15 years, I'd say, and with an increasing recognition that the distribution of any disease in the population is not constant, but it actually varies by a number of critical socioeconomic factors. We're really talking about disparities. It used to be biological vulnerability, now we're really talking about social vulnerability. So from a human standpoint, working in populations, we're very well suited to ensure that any theory that we put forward in terms of how methylmercury might increase risk for myocardial infarction, we really need to recognize how social factors might affect that. It might have everything to do with nutritional status and the extent to which you have a healthy diet or not. It might have to do with access to healthy food or exercise opportunities. To really believe that we can constrain it within the confines of an experiment is unrealistic. So I think environmental epi is moving in that direction, and that has to be factored in each time.
So to follow up on what Melissa was just saying, I think it's critical that we move in the direction of vulnerability biomarkers. So it's one thing to say somebody has more advantage or is more disadvantaged, but how does that relate to something we can measure? Because everybody's experience of that stress and disadvantage is going to be different, but is there some allostatic load parameter that we could be measuring in people? How do we quantify that in a group of people so we could start sorting that out? And in biochemical terms, you know, I talked about PON1, you know, as sort of a oxidative stress biomarker, systemic HDL biomarker that is pretty predictive of MI. And if you've got a toxic chemical that's hitting on that biochemical vulnerability marker for a disease, well, then you've got a natural chemical disease interaction that we could start going further with in epidemiology space, in experimental space, et cetera. So I think that the more epidemiology is being able to quantify vulnerability, whether it's in, you know, with BRCA1, and now we have a highly penetrant gene that is going to predict who gets breast cancer and who doesn't. And now we start understanding that there's epigenetic regulation of it, that you don't necessarily have to be born with a bad deck. You could develop a bad deck of cards with that gene through environmental exposures. So this is, I think, you know, when you have a penetrant gene and you could start working with that, great. I think the more epidemiology could pay attention to these vulnerability biomarkers, the much further along we're going to get in exactly your question.
Kevin Elliott from MSU. I wanted to get back to Lisa's really nice point about making decisions. And you know, at the beginning of the panel, you all were discussing that and considering the fact that there are consequences to decisions that are false positives and consequences when there are false negatives. And there's this, you know, really interesting philosophical literature, since you've so graciously kept referring to philosophy, where some people would say, look, there's so much judgment in many of these cases, you know, thinking back to like the first debate, you know, deciding, you know, is, you know, methylmercury contributing to cardiovascular disease? There's so many judgments involved in interpreting this evidence, and there are these significant consequences to being wrong. So maybe we don't want the scientists making these decisions. Maybe we want the regulators making them. And there's this really nice sort of terminology for this. Some people call it the clean hands science, dirty hands public policy view. So keep the scientists' hands clean. They shouldn't be making the decisions. They should be trying to somehow just lay out evidence and, make the regulators, make the policymakers make the decision. And then on the other hand, other people say, that may not be the best way to actually make decisions. The regulators are going to make a mess of it, and the scientists have a better understanding of whether a causal inference can be made. And so I think it's a really interesting debate. And the reason I bring it up is I think it's relevant to how we sort of think about what we're trying to accomplish here. Are we just trying to get at, causal understanding, or are we also thinking about how we communicate that causal understanding effectively between the scientists and decision makers? And I think it even comes back to Meredith's really nice point yesterday about, do the regulators need causal understanding in every case to make the decisions, or can they make decisions based on other kinds of evidence? So I know that's kind of a broad-ranging comment, but I guess my question is just sort of what you think about sort of, what are the nuances of communicating this causal information? Is it helpful? Can you just sort of lay out some of these Bradford Hill issues to the regulators and say, well, look, we have plausibility, we have temporality, we have this, but we don't have this. Now you make a decision, or do you need to actually make the decision? And I think this gets back to the issue of context. Maybe some contexts you need to give a simpler answer, and some contexts not so much. But I think I just invite us to be thinking about that as part of the context. And I don't know if you have any comments on your experiences or thoughts on that.
Okay. So we experience that within our world. There are mode of action studies that we perform. We assess them under the Bradford Hill guidelines. We provide white papers to the regulatory agencies, and then it is their decision on what to do with regard to that particular molecule. And I won't say whether I agree or disagree with those decisions. I mean, it's based on scientific judgment and their scientific judgment of our review of our scientific judgment. What's interesting about it, though, is that the same set of data will result in a very different result, will lead to a very different result, depending on what group of scientists are reviewing it. So we have the same set of data for the same molecule. We'll submit it to EPA versus Brazil versus Europe. And even in Europe, the scientists within a country may think one way, EFSA may think another way, ECHA may think another way. And actually, the lack of alignment on that makes that a really big challenge, because it leads to ambiguity within the regulatory paradigm. More consistency and more quantification of that, because they're really qualitative assessments, would be helpful in that regard. But I think sometimes we do that.
I think about it from a value-laden versus value-free kind of continuum, if you will, and that there are different shades of that, that if I were a theoretical physicist, I maybe really wouldn't be that concerned about changing the cosmos, but in fact, I just wanted to observe and describe it and perhaps predict it. But I went in, as an epidemiologist, I went into public health because I was really interested in affecting health. And therefore, if I was perhaps had that firewall between the kinds of research that I do and what regulation can do with it, what's to say that I'll even make very worthwhile inquiries? Where's the need or the urgency or the expectation to design studies that actually could mean something when it came to impacting public health? So I guess I'm not of the mind to be working hand in hand with regulators, but I certainly feel a certain responsibility or obligation to design studies that could be relevant for regulatory decisions.
And I really appreciate your question, because some people think of me as a regulator, but I'm in a regulatory environment. but I'm a risk assessor, and we really try to keep risk assessment, quote unquote, pure or clean from where the rubber meets the road, which is where the money decisions get made by the risk managers. And so that, I think, is a good ethic to try to keep, is to keep that separate. And so to be able to say to the risk manager that this is, if we're uncertain about something, but this is how bad it could be if this endpoint is causal and this risk is real. These are how big the stakes could be, and either we need to fill that gap by, looking for alternative assessments, as we heard about earlier, or do more research. It's critical research need maybe we're identifying, or maybe we're saying, a certain amount of prudence would be wise, but that's up to them, how they want to manage that, or just wait for some other regulatory body to decide, because we're a small state and there's much bigger states out there, or there's the federal government, or there's the world. So, but at least to be, and the word transparent is, it can mean different things in different contexts.
I just want to go back to Kim's point and talk about, we've just submitted a paper with colleagues from the California EPA who do risk assessment, where we're proposing that we replace the G by E paradigm by a new one called I by E, where we talk about intrinsic factors combined with extrinsic factors, where the idea is the intrinsic factors are things like genetics, sure, but also sex, age, and these sorts of things, combined with extrinsic factors, which include everything from socioeconomic status to your diet to chemical exposures. And this, we're proposing, has a big impact on epi and tox. I mean, Melissa just mentioned about for epi, they can do that. Instead of thinking of things as confounding, you start to merge them. And in toxicology, you have this possibility of stressing some animals or socially isolating them and being exposed. We think we need to move that, because clearly risk assessment presently doesn't fit what's observed in the communities, where you have people who are under stress, who are next to highways, bad housing conditions, are poor, etc., with chemical exposures. And so we need to move risk assessment to this I by E paradigm rather than a G by E. And it also fits, Gary, of course, with your favorite thing, the exposome, which is this idea that all of these exposures in the exposome are important and are combined with a genome. And so the problem, what I'd like to ask the committee to comment on, is this is all well and good in epi and and in toxicology with animals, but how do you stress a cell culture system? And how do you replace animals in that type of paradigm idea?
I will speak for the cells. The cells are stressed. The cells are actually incredibly stressed. If you compare the in vivo rat liver transcriptome profile to the in vitro primary hepatocyte rat liver transcriptome profile, they're drastically different. So the genes that are getting changed and upregulated within the in vitro system, they are very artificial, stressful situations in that regard. Taking that to the broader context, I think we need to be really clear about the questions that we're asking with the in vitro studies. So the in vitro studies in and of themselves are not one-to-one, or perhaps aren't one-to-one to their in vivo counterparts, but they're giving you an idea of the biological activity, giving you the idea of where you would be from a NOAEC type standpoint, a NOEL standpoint, for the purpose of then comparing that to the exposure and doing some sort of risk-based approach there. So I think it's not a one-for-one sort of putting it in and replacing it and hoping to get exactly what you would within the human situation. I think it's getting one step closer and at least having the same human cells. So the toxicodynamic component could be the same, and then it's going to require some bridging and more knowledge to be able to get there.
So I think we have a lot of opportunities here to address that question on a lot of different levels. one, it's very easy to manipulate those cells and put them in different environments, take cells from different individuals. There's all kinds of things we can do to characterize that variability and to simulate different situations in the dish, but then also computationally when we go to back out what would be the human exposure that would be consistent with this concentration in vitro. We routinely use basically distributions of age, of gender, BMI, things like that do affect the ADME characteristics to understand what the range of exposures that we need to worry about are, what would be the more sensitive populations, things like that.
Hi, I'm Sue Norton from EPA. I'm the ecologist in the group. I think there's another one back there. Yay. I want to thank the panel for illustrating the vast number of issues and different parts of the problem that we are dealing with in this issue of causation. But I want to echo this guy's point that when we drill down in the details, I think we have to keep our eyes on the prize and build a knowledge base of what we have learned about these causal relationships. And I think connecting those dots with all of these different pieces of evidence coming together is a subject area for work and something that we can do better to communicate both to the regulators and the regulated community and to the public about what it is we understand about causation from all these different aspects. So that's my comment.
So we also have a question from the web that I think is kind of being addressed, is what is being done to translate the methods we develop as scientists to inform in decision making? And I think this committee and the stakeholders are a good example of it, is that many of these regulatory bodies are represented here hearing these scientific questions, and but others that are, we don't really have many of the regulators up here, but the sort of kind of like, how is that being done? This is one example, but the person on the web was asking for any other thoughts on that? Probably more for the answers on the regulatory side, but how you listen to these things happening on the scientific side, but I mean, you're keeping up with the literature and listening and attending these sorts of meetings, right? I mean, that's kind of the main way. I'm not really getting much response.
I think about it very much in terms of the mission of this committee on emerging sciences for environmental decision making. Whatever the committee is working to invest in by way of an agenda and topical areas, it's very much affected by what the key issues are with respect to regulatory decision making. And having our agency liaisons as part of our committee planning in a very robust way is essential. So it's not as though I could imagine our committee going forward without being very true to its charge, and that is, are the questions and the topics that we're selecting responsive to emerging issues where agency representatives are saying, what's the current thinking, and please don't forget how practical this can be. Please don't forget to keep in mind that we're going to have to utilize this information rather than just equivocate in a rhetorical and mutually fascinating way. So I'd say that that's been the mission of the committee, to ensure that it's highly relevant.
Well, I think certainly there are obviously many other activities in the scientific and bridging sorts of arenas, certainly things like weight of evidence framework, systematic reviews, key event characteristics, key characteristics, for instance, of carcinogens. Those kinds of efforts are, I think, all efforts to develop organizing principles that can allow people, both from the scientific community who are putting this evidence together, to put them together in a systematic way, and for people from the regulatory community or from the public health sector, or other related areas, to then take a look at that information and use it in a way that's appropriate for their context. So I don't think it's happening. I don't think these sorts of causal association assessments and these sorts of things really happen in a vacuum. They're almost always happening, and there are a lot of frameworks that are being developed to allow us both to look at systematically across literature and across areas of science to try to integrate. So I don't think it's being done. I don't think it's missing. I think it's active and has many characteristics, many manifestations at this point.
I think part of the question was directed at, well, what is the utility of some of what we're talking about? And I think it would be good if we started seeing examples, for example, come out of the high throughput testing that turned into changes or practice. For example, I think maybe the Deepwater Horizon chemicals that we use to break up those dispersants, I think they might have been put through TOSCAS. Some examples like that would help, I think, illustrate the coming utility of what we're talking about.
So this is John Bukhari, NIEHS NTP, and I think that this particular discussion right now is really relevant to what we face. So we have activities in animal toxicology, we have activities in vitro toxicology, we have activities in systematic review and developing ways of integrating evidence. We also have regulations that require us to, through our ICVAM activities, to replace tests with new alternative assays that recapitulate the animal data. Not recapitulate human experience, but recapitulate animal data. So in our efforts at bringing this together, we look at causality and we look at confidence. And the animal data, I think, have been generated over the years because it's easy to see causality there, right? Then we bring in epidemiology studies, and they look at the causality in a different light and bring in more of the Bradford Hill criteria. And then as we try to move into the in vitro area, we're faced with either comparing with the animal data, but we also need to bring in all these factors from the Bradford Hill and the other areas of systematic review to understand how much confidence we have in the in vitro assays or the new data that are coming online. So there's a push-pull here, and the law right now is inhibiting us somewhat from moving away from what we would like to be doing, and what this committee, I think, can help us generate the enthusiasm to move forward. And yet we're still held back in sort of the 19th century, 20th century science. So I'd love to hear some reaction as to how we can move more towards a confidence-based regulatory assessment process rather than a proof of causality-based regulatory assessment, which I think is reflective in the ICVAM Authorization Act.
John, I agree with you 100%. And I think it's a false prophecy to go one for one from an in vitro to in vivo, and the target should not be the animal models. I mean, I think the work that is happening within the government along these lines with NICEDM and other entities is moving in the right direction. I think what it's going to require, though, in order to help accelerate that as well, is to have the companies perhaps share more about their internal processes, because the internal decisions need to be made about molecule development with pretty significant investments before it even starts to get onto the regulator's radar. And there are decisions that are made that are mostly based upon potential issues in humans as opposed to in animal models. So, and that's not an endpoint to endpoint type thing. That is looking broadly based. So I think we need to maybe share those things more and be forced to share those things more across our community and between the different communities.
Now we're probably running low on time, but just off of the top of my head reflection, a couple of points that came up in this discussion this morning. One is that Richard's question about what do we know about what doesn't work, and related to Kim's question about publication bias, and then the point that I tried to make about failure and the extent to which we are forthcoming about our failures and about our models that don't work and our willingness to let them go. And I don't think we've been aggressive enough to do that. in order to move toward the kind of decisiveness and confidence that John's talking about.
I think the meeting's over. Those are your closing remarks, Kim. Joel, you got cut off, I'm afraid.
So the exit is out this door and to the left. You can follow the exit signs. I will say, I think Kim and Melissa, or maybe if we have like 10 or less minutes on the break, we'll reconvene, or should we just go straight to lunch and then the meeting? So let's call the workshop over. Thank you all of the speakers and participants for the, and